Hola a todos y todas, bienvenidos a Viaje al Sentido. Today we are doing our 83rd interview in Viaje al Sentido, and it's going to be the first one in English. So Chris, you have the privilege to be the first one that we will interview. We will do a full interview in English, and it's a privilege to have you here with us, Chris. Chris is professor of psychology at the University of Northampton and director of the Center for Psychology and Social Sciences that is based there. He is president of the Society for Psychical Research, chairman of the British Psychological Society Transpersonal Psychology section, past president of the Parapsychology Association, and the international affiliate for England of the Parapsychology Foundation. So very welcome and a privilege to have you with us, Chris.
Thank you for inviting me.
Chris, we're going to get very in-depth from the beginning and very intense. We'd like an answer on the big questions. So after your experience and your journey in life and the research and the extensive research you've done on parapsychology that you've done and that you've seen, what are the current answers that you have to the three big questions? Where do we come from, who we are, and where are we going?
I'm really sorry to disappoint you so early, but I can't give you answers to those questions except to say that the answers that we have within the current academic mainstream are clearly inadequate. So the answers that you'll be given from many spokespeople will say that consciousness is a byproduct of brain activity, it's localized in the physical body, it dies when the person dies, and has abilities through the senses and through the motor systems. And those things don't seem to be true. They don't seem to be true in lived experience, in spontaneous ways in the real world, and they don't seem to be true in the laboratory either.
And why do you think it doesn't seem to be true?
Well, because I think scientists have an obligation to respond to people's experience every day and the beliefs that they have. And people's everyday experience suggests to them that under certain circumstances, they have phenomena that suggest that consciousness can be separate from the body. So that might be in the form, for example, of visiting a medium. And the medium might provide you with information that you regard as convincing evidence that your loved ones who've died still live. And they're still able to look down on you and have an interest in your life and can reminisce about experiences that you shared with them that are intimate, that nobody else knew about.
And then how can you defend, Chris, that parapsychology is a science?
I mean, there are a number of features to that. So first of all, there's this idea that you dismiss something as simply an anecdote. People report an experience in their everyday life, and of course they could be mistaken. Might be factors at work that they're not aware of, or they may have misperceived or misremembered the situation. But of course, that's true of any human experience. And if we simply threw everything away, any account of a memory or an experience, an eyewitness testimony of a crime, if all of that was completely dismissed, we wouldn't be able to move anywhere. So the key, of course, is, as a scientist, is to take those claims and start to explore the ways in which we might explain them by normal means. What might those factors be? And start to build those into our models and our experimental tests. So a really good example might be with mediumship. So if you sit with a medium and they give you information that seems to be really impressive, a skeptic might say, well, of course, the medium might have known that you were coming to sit with them, and they might have done some research on the internet and found out all about you in that way. So if we want to do an experimental test, we make sure that the claimant, the medium, has no way of knowing about the clients before the interaction, the sitting takes place. We might say, well, people give away information non-verbally when they're interacting with each other, and maybe the medium is picking up on that non-verbal information, and that's helping them to arrive at accurate information. So again, in an experiment, we can build in maybe an experimental condition where you don't actually see the clients. They're behind a screen or they're watching through a CCTV, and see if that affects the performance, if it affects the quality of the information. So there are lots of ways as a scientist where we can move away from the real world and the anecdotes into a situation where we have much more control over the variables and can start to test those counter explanations very directly and see if they can explain away the phenomena.
Now we're getting into the evidence. Right? We're getting into the hard data, no? So there's been a century of research, no? So how would you demonstrate us there is really a strong case for evidence on C phenomenon,
So the first thing to say is we need to make the right kind of comparison between the evidence that we've accumulated in parapsychology and other equivalent sciences. And one technique that's often used by skeptics is to try and make a comparison with the natural sciences. So if you're working in physics or in chemistry, for example, you can measure things with great precision, and you can expect your phenomena to replicate. So if something is true, if you do perform one action in one situation, you put a bunch of chemicals together in this laboratory, you get the same reactions as you would get in another laboratory. That doesn't apply in the social sciences. In the social sciences, our subject matter is conscious, it's sentient itself. I've run experiments before where my participants were running their own experiments in my experiment. So, of course, there are consequences. That means that in the social sciences generally, so, psychology, human geography, sociology, we don't see those kinds of properties in our experiments. Instead, we see effect sizes and we see replication across a whole body of evidence. So if a dozen people conduct the same experiment, they won't all get the same result, but there will be a shift. They will all tend to show glimmers of the phenomenon. And there'll be a little kind of distribution over here when it should be over here. And in parapsychology, what we find is our effect sizes are about the same size as we see in other areas of psychology. So it suggests a human attribute. Our replication rates are about the same as we see in other areas of psychology. So there's nothing peculiar or unusual about parapsychology. There's nothing especially delicate about the phenomena we're looking at because they're spiritual in nature in some way. That means that they're harder to produce or that they're more difficult to replicate. The bottom line is relatively few people attempt those replications in the first place. If more people did, we'd have a much larger body of evidence. So to answer your question more directly, I think the evidence we have is very respectable in comparison with the evidence we see from other disciplines. It's just a smaller database because there are fewer people working.
What would you say to people that say that after 50 years of quite a lot of strong piece of research, there is clearly not a substantial evidence on this phenomenon?
Well, I think I'd refer back to my earlier answer and just ask, well, what would count as a robust body of evidence? It's interesting, for example, that you mentioned the remote viewing work with the US military and intelligence agencies. But of course, they spent over $20 million over more than 20 years supporting that initiative. So if they were incapable of producing any information that was useful to them, it beggars belief that they spent so long financing it over such a long time. So I think that probably misrepresents that database as well. I think what we see are phenomena that absolutely replicate in much the same way as any other human capacity. If we're looking at, for example, empathy or altruism, if we're looking at some fairly basic phenomena in memory or perception, I don't think the evidence here is any less robust. I don't think it's any more meager. I think it absolutely bears comparison. And I guess if we had a longer conversation, I'd be asking, well, let's have a look at some of the evidence and maybe you can share with me what exactly your problems are with the data, why you think it's not very impressive or why you think the effects are small. Because from my perspective, they kind of look like what we would expect to see if it involves human beings.
And the second argument that I have is, and you're very familiar with it, it's the white crow experiment, no? That we know that all crows are black, no? But if there was only one white crow that could be validated constantly in a controlled trial, it would be enough to validate the whole C phenomenon, no? but that is not the case yet. No, and I'm sure you're familiar also with the $1 million paranormal challenge of James Randi, no, that offered 1 million to anyone that could demonstrate on a regular basis in a controlled trial a paranormal ability, and that seemed never to happen. So why is it that difficult to find one single individual that could demonstrate constantly that he has a paranormal ability in a controlled trial?
Well, again, my first response is, are there other areas of human achievement where we do expect that? So, for example, if we were told that there's this guy, Lionel Messi, who's very good at scoring goals, and we turn up and watch him in one match and he fails to score, is that a refutation of the claim? Are we saying that Messi isn't a goal scorer at all? If we hear about a wonderful comedian and we give them 30 seconds, okay, hit me with your best gag, and their joke we don't find particularly funny, does that mean this person isn't a comedian or an artist, and they produce a piece of work, a sketch from Picasso? Some sketches are less impressive and less impactful than other sketches, even from Picasso. And we don't in those situations think that completely undermines the claim, because if you really have this attribute, you should be able to use it 100% and demonstrate it to order. That doesn't seem to be how human beings are. And if we give one example, for example, which is that human beings' performance is very much affected by situational factors. And when we go back to sports, for example, sports people are very superstitious. And one of the reasons they're superstitious is because the situation is out of their control. There are so many factors over which they have no control that they use that as a way of eliciting a sense of control, and very subtle things can affect you really badly. So you tackle early on in a game and suddenly you're not really feeling yourself very well, and your performance through the whole match is terrible. And yet the very next day, for no reason that's obvious that you could put your finger on, you're man of the match, you're the player of the game or the tournament. So some things have changed very subtly and produce enormous differences. And I think the same is true here. Human beings' performance are massively affected. Just imagine the occasion you go for a job interview and your sense from an early question is that one of the panel members is very cold towards you and isn't terribly impressed. That can completely put you off. And this could be the worst interview you've ever given in your life, and you certainly don't get the job. So those kind of things we have to be aware of if we're talking about human beings, that it probably isn't realistic to think about a white crow in that respect. But we absolutely have a number of individuals. Some of those people are still giving demonstrations. People like Joe McMoneagle, who worked on the remote viewing program, for example. When he was alive, somebody like Ingo Swann, Mrs. Piper and Mrs. Leonard as mediums, who between them were tested for something like 60 years. Not continually, so not in a single stretch, but over 60 years they gave mediumship demonstrations to the satisfaction of the researchers, and were never once caught cheating, for example. Some days were off days, the information was not very good at all. On other days it was astonishing. So that, I think, is more typical of human performance.
And one very promising field also, Chris, are the near-death experiences. No, there's a growing evidence on the existence of near-death experiences. No, so I was wondering, where are we standing at the moment with the NDAs? Are we close to getting somewhere, or is it just a growing field that still is based on individual accounts, and there are not still those many research projects done that could really demonstrate that the phenomenon is ontologically real, no?
I think we're faced with a challenge because the mainstream view is extremely robust and well established, and it takes a long time to break that down through evidence. Counterfactual evidence. I think we're really helped again by technological advances, because in the time when Ray Moody was first talking about NDEs in the 1970s, resuscitation terribly successful. So most people who were near death died. Now we have a fabulous situation where many more people who have been clinically dead can actually be revived and come back to life and have an opportunity to share with us their experiences that they might have had. So it will lead to an opening up of data. We'll have much more material to work with. And that allows us then to do more systematic work. So, for example, do people tend to have NDEs only with certain health conditions and not others? Are they affected by various kinds of treatments? So things like naloxone that's often given, does that impact on after a cardiac arrest? Does that impact on the particular kind of experience that you might have later on? And if we start to see more patterns there again, that might lead us to a situation where we can start to theorize a bit better. But at the moment, the focus mainly seems to be on showing that the current view is wrong, rather than providing an alternative view.
Let me get in this. We're getting to the end, Chris, but I would like to get a bit more personal now.
Okay.
We've already gone through the evidence and the existing evidence, but now I have a personal question. Chris, what have you seen with your eyes that is extraordinary? What have been like subjective experiences for you that have really, I mean, you haven't been able to explain it with a materialistic point of view, that have been magic or something extraordinary, but that you've really seen it with your eyes, or that have been very close to it?
I'm going to start by mentioning that in my office here, I have a spoon that's got a twist and a kink in it, like a psychokinesis effect.
Yeah.
And that was produced for me by a friend and a colleague at the end of a conference where we were having a cup of tea together in a kind of a reception. And he asked me for my spoon, and I passed it over. He flicked it up. He never touched it, and it landed on the floor with a bend and a twist in it. And he's a sleight of hand magician.
Wow.
And so he produced it by trickery. And I have that in my office to remind me, like every other human being, that I'm a very poor observer. And that the way I think things happened may not be a guarantee of how things actually happened. So I think that's really, for humility's sake, it's really important that personal observations are not given too much credence. Having said that, I'm also somebody who came to parapsychology not because I had personal beliefs or experiences. I came as somebody who wanted to be a scientist and to do research on the big questions that you started with. Who are we? Why are we here? What is the purpose of all this? And came to psychology as a way of trying to answer some of those questions. I have many colleagues who did have personal experiences early on in life, and that's been a driving force for them, but not for me. And I'm not a particularly psychic kind of person. I haven't had lots of personal experiences in my everyday life. But I have been involved in a great deal of research, which has been quite successful. And within that, some of that research has been jaw-droppingly accurate. So I can recall occasions when we have our standard situation where we'll have a participant in that mild altered state. So they'll be in a very comfortable chair, reclined. They'll have eye shields on and headphones on. And we ask them to imagine taking a look at a video clip that's been randomly chosen by a computer for one among hundreds of clips, and they've no idea what those clips might include, the videos, and they give their description of what's coming into their imagination. And we write that down, and then we show them 4 video clips, the one that is their target, and 3 alternatives, 3 decoys. And of course, only the computer knows which is which. We don't know which is which. And on some of those occasions, the correspondences between the imagination and the video clip that we see that turns out to be the target, it's as if somebody has watched the video clip and then said, okay, well, what can I remember of that video clip? Somebody came running down some stairs, a car came driving by really quickly. You know, it's quite literal and extremely difficult to account for just in terms of a chance coincidence. Now, I say all of this, I want to be sure that anybody watching this interview doesn't necessarily think that I'm kind of trying to persuade people that these phenomena are all real. Absolutely. The most important message I want to get across is the only way to investigate these phenomena is scientifically, and that nobody wants to fool themselves. If it turns out that we're mistaken, that none of these phenomena are real, I think as a society, as humankind, would be better off knowing that fact. So I am very open to the idea that that phenomena will be disproven in the experiments that we conduct. But I have to say, to date, certainly when it comes to ESP, that's not what we found. We've built up a really healthy database of effects. Now, for psychokinesis, I've done some research with PK, and that hasn't been at all successful. So personally, I am much more skeptical about PK than I am about ESP.
Chris, I have one last question, and we should,
Okay.
because we're already out of time. But you mentioned before that, for instance, you see more evidence on ESP than on psychokinesis. I was wondering, where are you seeing the most prominent advances for the next 5-10 years? In what areas or what really researchers around the world are right now in the edge with the experiments that we can see something very special and very extraordinary within the next 5-10 years? Where should we look at in terms of fields and in terms of people?
Well, I think some of it revolves around this convergence of some features that suggest that there's something important about unconscious processing that we do as human beings, which isn't at all controversial. The idea that much of the way in which we gather information and make sense of it, we have no conscious awareness of at all. We just get the results of that. And some of those research approaches seem to reflect that idea that psi might enter the system unconsciously. And that's also reflected in the altered states work, because when people are in altered states, the boundary between the conscious ego and unconscious becomes thinner. So it's more permeable, information passes through. That fits in with that. And some of the neuroscience work that's going on at the moment that might allow us to identify the mechanisms that control that boundary between conscious and unconscious, that I feel like they're all coming together. And if they do paint a common picture, I think that will be really exciting going forwards. The other answer is more practical. I think even though we are a small community, as I say, hundreds rather than thousands, I think what we could hope to do is to coordinate our activity better so that we're all working on a common problem, in that kind of meta experiment thing that we talked about earlier. If we did a little bit more of that, then I think we could maybe make more substantial advances, because we're all addressing the same problem areas at the same time. I think that would be a good thing to do.
And three or four people that you admire in the field that we should take a look at, the people that are interested in the field?
If people are interested in the field, I think I would start with people who are public facing. So people like Dean Radin, for example, Julia Mossbridge, or people who write popular accounts which are really well grounded in what's actually going on in the field. But these days, frankly, so many people do things like podcasts or interviews. There's the New Thinking Aloud collection of interviews that people might want to check out as well. There are lots of ways where you can access the whole community of researchers, and they're all wonderful people, as you might imagine. This is a discipline that weeds out people. You really have to be committed to the scientific method and believe that something important is going on here if you're ever going to be able to get tenure or eke out a living working in this area. And so it tends to be survival of the fittest. So I think it would be interesting to listen to any of those people.
Chris, it's been wonderful conversation. Thank you very much for your time. I think we did great, and I think we did great in English for the first interview of our podcast. So thank you very much, Chris, and it's been an honor to have you.
Thank you. I hope people understand me. I have a regional accent and I talk quickly, but I hope people were able to understand some of it.
For sure. Take care.
Great.
Bye.
See you soon.